concentration.
Thank you for spending this half hour with us on Chapter and Verse. Welcome to Part 2 with Ray Dempsey's guest, Professor J. Stanley Clemens, retired Professor Emeritus, Rhode Island College, Ray's alma mater, Rick.
Yeah.
So,
we were just talking
yes,
between the programs about how things are beginning to change. In the 20th century, there was a lot of bloodshed in China, in Russia, in Nazi Germany, which had some Christian trappings at the beginning, but not so much as the Nazi experience went on. In fact, Adolf Hitler gave copies of, I think it was the book, I think it was one of the books of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was known for the God is dead Superman idea, to his friend Stalin and the leader of, and Mussolini. And I don't know if he gave a copy to his cohorts in Japan. But anyway, in the 20th century, we have seen the rise of the theory and practice of the secular state, and more than 100 million citizens killed, not by religion, but by atheist governments. And there have also been some problems in our country having to do with social issues, which are also religious issues. So that there's D. James Kennedy, the late D. James Kennedy of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, has begun to talk about the co-belligerence within religion fighting the secular state against abortion, assisted suicide, mass murder, and other things as well, and against the secular state. Roger Williams, he didn't really, or did he, have a concept or a vision or an experience or a prescription for what we are to do if there is an incursion by the secular state, so that the secular state becomes a threat to safety. Did he?
A threat to safety or to religion?
Well, just actual, Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, atheists in a secular state, and others within the, Pol Pot, he killed 3 million, which is a small number compared to, there's an estimate that there has been over 100 million people who have been killed by their own governments. Mm-hmm. And of course the Nazis, they turned the Jews into internal exiles, following what they believed to be the...
Let me answer that in this respect. I think Roger Williams would look at these people and say they are guilty of monstrous partiality. Each of these sort of views, whatever it might be, whether it's a particular religious view or a particular secular view, which sees itself as having the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and then try to impose that upon everybody else, leads to these kind of great massacres. Rhino Niebuhr had a book that he wrote back in the 1950s called The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, in which he talked about so many of the sort of terrible things that have happened in history have been done by what he called the children of light, people who thought they had God on their side and thought they needed to somehow impose that upon everybody. And he details this, that these people think they're doing good, but they end up doing great evil, which he thought is the great irony. Over and over and over again, people think, oh, I know what's good, and I'll see to it that you are good too, even though that's not your version of good. Williams, on the other hand, was very much concerned that people not do this kind of thing, that they not be so certain of themselves that they then try to use the power of government against them, whether it's religious or atheistic or whatever it might be. He just believes that nobody is God, and therefore everyone is imperfect, and therefore you cannot assume that you've got it right. He even would doubt himself in some respects. That while he was profoundly religious, he did not think that he had all the answers and could say, okay, you got to believe what I'm going to believe, or I'm going to cut your head off or hang you or something else. That is the sin, if you like, of the secularists, the anti-religious ones. You know, Adolf Hitler's an atheist. He's anti-Christian. You know, he takes the cross and twists it. And atheism is the official religion, in a sense, if you like, a faith, if you like, of some of these other regimes. I think Pol Pot probably thought he was going to purify his country of all the corruptions, and therefore you end up killing a substantial proportion of his population.
Yes.
So I think Williams's answer to this is that nobody, no matter where they come from, needs to think of that they've got their answer to everything and try to impose that upon anybody. And I don't know how you stop people from doing that unless you could convince them. Take a step back and realize, you know, you're not God. You don't have the answer. You don't have the answers. You only have a partial answer, and that partiality, that part is maybe what you like, but you can't impose that upon everybody else.
Did he believe in what is known today? There's a common idea today that there is a collective wisdom within a population. Some people would say capitalism is such an expression of the will of the people. Did Roger Williams have a confidence in capitalism or in the electoral process or something like that?
What they call capitalism is, that we call capitalism, is a little more later development. The Puritan world was is sort of medieval with respect to trade and commerce. They believed in setting wages and what have you, and having maximum prices and price controls. And they had very, very, very much into the idea of the fair market, that you didn't charge more than you ought to, and you couldn't hoard and so on, which may run counter to a lot of capitalist ideas. So it's probably, capitalism is not exactly something. On the question of democracy, Rhode Island was described as a democratical system. Now, it's not as democratic as we would have today, because it was limited, first of all, to heads of households. So the father, in effect, of a house would have the vote. In addition to that, then, they had a concept that voters would be called freemen, and these people would be admitted to the town government by a vote of the people in the town. But no woman, no slave, no child, sometimes younger sons and all, they would not be freemen until, well, no blacks, Indians, or women, or even, just, that was inconceivable. But in terms of the white male population, one could become a freeman after you probably had achieved a certain amount of prosperity, had a home and so forth, some property and all. And they all had a vote. And in the town meetings, which were highly democratic, I mean, all the people who were allowed to vote would come there and vote on any particular issue. That's as democratic as you could get in the 17th century. Now, we may not regard that as particularly democratic now, but you cannot accuse them of being undemocratic when our notion of democracy is inconceivable, just inconceivable.
What was his thoughts on
when he organized the town of Providence with their first compact, they agreed they would abide by the majority rule of the heads of households. And that would be basically what was going to happen in Rhode Island as they proceeded through the 17th century. heads of households and so-called freemen, people who were allowed to, who were voted into the voting population, they all could vote on issues. And in Rhode Island in the 17th century, they had elections all the time. You know, they elected the town council twice a year. They elected the deputies to the central government twice a year. They elected governor every year, et cetera,
frequently.
et cetera. Oh yeah, all the time. And it was so it's more democratic than most places. And part of the reason why the neighboring colonies thought of Rhode Island as a horror show is because they had this democratical system. When they set it up, it was called democratical. And in fact, when Charles II signed the 1663 charter, it talks about the government being democratical in Rhode Island. Now, it's as democratical as it could possibly be in that time. We don't think it is so much today, but that's so radical. In fact, all these ideas about separation of church and state and freedom of religion, democracy, are so radical that almost everybody thought if you let them get loose, you're going to bring about the end of civilization as they knew it, which of course is true.
It was interesting, at the end of last week's program, we were mentioning Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Was he influenced by the writings of Roger Williams as well?
Not as far as we know. We have no evidence whatsoever that Thomas Jefferson ever read a word of Williams.
How about James
However, maybe not James Madison either, but however, they were both, Madison and Jefferson were both very much influenced by John Locke.
Yeah. And
John Locke's ideas are parallel to those of Roger Williams, except John Locke didn't think that Catholics should be tolerated, whereas Williams did. Williams would tolerate Catholics and atheists. John Milton, who we know was influenced by Roger Williams, changed his mind from being intolerant to believing that freedom of religion except for atheists. But Williams would accept even atheists and Catholics to be free to have their own conscience as it was. We know that Locke knew about Milton, and since his writings reflect so much the very basic ideas of Locke, most historians think that Locke based a lot of his ideas on Williams, and Madison and Jefferson were heavily influenced by Locke. So if you want to see the path from Williams to Jefferson, it's through that. They didn't, so far as we know, they never read a word of Williams. Another point I would make is that Isaac Backus, great Baptist historian and pastor in the 18th century, who was at the forefront of the effort to disestablish the church in Massachusetts, wrote a history of the Baptists. It was substantial, and it was published right about the time just before the American Revolution, at least the first volume of it. And in it, he quotes at length Roger Williams' work, and he raises Roger Williams up. Now, it's quite likely that Madison might have read that. I don't know. But of course, Madison is being heavily influenced by John Leland, the Baptist pastor in Orange County. And it's Leland and the Baptists who pressed so hard to get an amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing the separation of church and state. They didn't think, the Baptists didn't think that the original Constitution protected enough and separated church and state. Because all the original Constitution says is that there'll be no religious test for any federal office. Yeah. They didn't think that was quite adequate enough. And they pressed Madison. Now, you see, Madison didn't believe there should be a Bill of Rights. The reason is quite simple. He says, you try to make a list. If you leave something out, somebody later on is going to say, you don't have it. And it's precisely what's happened. Justice Rehnquist, Justice Scalia, Justice Thomas, and others have said, I don't see these rights in the Constitution, therefore you don't have them. This is exactly what Madison feared. His view was, everything that's not written in there, people have. And unless it says the government can't do this, people can do everything. It was 5 Supreme Court justices written signed on to a decision written by Anton Scalia, which said we can no longer we can no longer, we can no longer afford full religious freedom. It's something about that religious freedom, full religious freedom is a luxury you can't afford any longer.
Is that right?
That's right.
Wow.
And he's still sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court right now, backed up by Thomas and others who think the same thing. Rehnquist's view was that the Constitution doesn't prohibit the establishment, basically, of Christianity. He says it just says you cannot establish a particular church, but you could, he thinks, establish Christianity. Well, if he knows what James Madison believed in, all one has to do is read James Madison's remonstrance that he wrote in 1785 in opposition to Patrick Henry's attempt to make Virginia a Christian state. He lists, I mean, it's a document that Roger Williams could have written. He lists like 15 or 16 different reasons why the government should have no role to play in religion. And he defeats Henry's attempt to subsidize all the Christian churches. Defeats it. And then what's wonderful is it turns around and then the Virginia government passed Thomas Jefferson's statute on religious freedom, which disestablished the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church in Virginia, secularized their constitution entirely. John Leland was behind the efforts by Madison and all to do this, and so were the Baptists. And John Leland was also behind the effort to disestablish the church in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So here's one Baptist pastor who had a hand in getting rid of the state churches in 3 of the states of the United States. Because you know the U.S. Constitution did not do away with state churches. That was a state matter. Yeah. And it's not until the 20th century when they start to apply the Bill of Rights to the states do you get all these controversies about, where's the line between church and state? Because up to the 20th century, most states did whatever they wanted with respect to church and state. But some of them had state churches supported by tax money down to Massachusetts down to as late as 1833. But Leland is one of the people who brought that to an end. And he's the very person who pressured Madison into supporting a Bill of Rights and having an amendment that separates church and state.
Say a little bit more about the Supreme Court, our United States Supreme Court. They said that we can't afford religious freedom.
Yeah, he said it's a luxury you can't afford any longer.
What did they mean by that?
Well, the case that was involved was Smith versus Oregon, in which there was a counselor who was a drug counselor, as a matter of fact, who was a Native American who uses peyote in his religious rituals. And so he was fired. And this case went clear up to the United States Supreme Court, and Scalia wrote this decision, which 5 justices signed, in which he says that full religious freedom is a luxury we can't afford anymore. And that led then to the effort by the Clinton administration to pass the Religious Restoration Act. And then, we've been round and round on to try to get the government out of trying to determine what religion is. Another kind of case was the one involving, and this is one where the Supreme Court got it right. There was a small religious group called Santeria, which used chicken sacrifices and things like that in their rituals and all. And the town of Hialeah, Florida, tried to pass a ordinance forbidding the slaughter of animals outside of recognized or licensed slaughterhouses. And it was a blatant attempt to use sort of a health law, to try to put these religious people out of business. Well, that went clear to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in that case said these people have a right to their rituals. And so, but these are, every single term, the Supreme Court is faced with some issue that comes up that looks at what is the border between church and state. And of course, it's been vague for a long time because throughout almost all the 19th century, Protestantism dominated, and you had basically a Protestant establishment. So that the public schools used the King James Bible, which is why the Catholics set up their own parochial schools. They didn't want this Protestant Bible being foisted on their kids. As a matter of fact, the first instance where the Bibles were kicked out of the schools was in Ohio in the 1880s as a result of a court case brought by the Roman Catholics. They got rid of Bible reading in Ohio around 1881 or 83, something like that. And because they were using a Protestant version of it. And they said, you know, either don't do it or let us have ours too. So they did away with it. So the first anti-Bible reading thing was way back in the 19th century, brought by a persecuted minority.
Interesting. There has been some sentiment in Europe on behalf of secularism or atheism. It's kind of discouraging, and it may relate to what we talked about last week about the religious wars. There was I think it was a television presentation where they interviewed some citizen of, I think it might have been France or England, and they said, well, apparently the religious, the Christian activity right now in France is very low. Participation is like 3%.
Yeah.
And so it's not a very large demographic. Islam is becoming more strong in Europe, but not so much Christianity. And they asked this person, I think it was a gal, about her sentiments about Christianity, and she said, there's been too much war, too much bloodshed. We know, because of our history, where this thing can lead. Yeah. And now it's being used against Christianity.
Well, you have to understand that the establishment of secular states in almost every country in Europe had to do it over the dead bodies of kings and priests, because they were always in league against each other. It's like Voltaire saying something like strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. That was and so you had this extraordinary anti-clerical view that came out of all the revolutions of Europe. They had, in order to achieve their freedoms, they had to free themselves from the church and their alliance with the state, with the kings, the monarchy, and the aristocracy in many cases too. So revolution after revolution found that their chief opponents were the church and the monarchy. That's not true here. We never had that problem here. So as a result, we never had this kind of anti-clerical, anti-religious sort of sentiment. And so we've just rolled on. The Baptists and Methodists particularly benefited so tremendously in the early republic after the Constitution freed them to propagate wherever they wanted to. We didn't have the same problems. And so the reputation of the church in so many places. You take a look at Italy. In order to become united, they had to defeat the Pope and take away the papal states. They literally had to go attack the Pope and his armies in order to unite the country. So why don't they become anti-clerical, become suspicious of the church? Because they see that as part of the arm of the past, the oppressors of the past. That wasn't true here, and so we've never had that kind of...
The Pope and his army. Yeah. You're right, there's a lot of power there.
Yeah, they literally, you know, when you hear about Garibaldi and all these people, they had to actually go conquer the papal states. And they the Pope locked himself up for about 70 years after that.
There was
only Mussolini let him out.
Really?
1920, oh yeah. Mussolini saw himself as a great Christian.
Oh.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There are two opinion leaders in our generation, the 60s and 70s. There was a group, an influential group called the Beatles. Yeah. From Britain. Yeah. And they asked Paul McCartney about religion, and for years he's had the same kind of European response. He said it leads to violence. Yeah. And we're not for it. His co-worker, collaborator John Lennon, wrote what is sometimes called an international human anthem called Imagine. Mm-hmm. Imagine there's no religion, no heaven, no hell, no religion to live or die for and stuff. And there is that, there is, I guess, a European religious sentiment. Although Paul McCartney, whose dad was a fireman, his name is James Paul McCartney. His dad was a fireman, and he was asked to give a concert after our 9/11 experience, with the terrorists in New York City, and he did ask for God's blessing on America, which is unusual for Paul McCartney, and maybe
That is unusual, yeah.
and maybe unusual for a lot of people in Europe. Maybe.
Well, you might take some comfort in those attitudes, in that would be a great check upon the kind of militant Muslim world, which might want to merge church and state again. I mean, they look upon. I mean, what you see going on in the world right now is a kind of a war by, I'm sorry to say, fundamentalists of all kinds, Christian or Muslim, et cetera, who are all trying to find a kind of a rearguard action against the modern world and wanting to go back and impose what they think the past once was. And they're very much upset, and so they come out in political terms, trying to impose their religious agenda upon their particular countries. And this anti-clerical view that you see almost all over Western Europe will probably prevent that from occurring there.
Maybe so. Maybe so. Although the Sharia law has begun to assert itself remarkably. The Prime Minister of Germany, Merkel,
Angela Merkel.
I think it was she who said that the experience in assimilation in Germany had failed. Some of the neighborhoods in Great Britain, it is said, are no longer places where the police want to venture because of the acceptance of Sharia law.
Well, that would only be among the Muslims. I mean, a non-Muslim person living in those neighborhoods would pay no attention to Sharia law. It's the people who regard that as a holy law that are going to pay any attention. So they go to these courts that are run by the imams or whatever it might be and settle issues there because they don't trust the English courts. Now, those decisions, and I know they've had some instances of this in Scandinavia, those decisions have no weight in secular law. If a Sharia court hands down some decision, no matter what it is, the secular court says, sorry, that doesn't, we don't recognize that. No place in Western Europe or the United States is Sharia law recognized as valid as a way of settling issues. Now, it's the same, if people going to a mosque want to submit themselves to that, that's their business. The same way in a Baptist church, if we want to do what we want to do and say, you're kicked out of here because you've done this, or if you commit adultery or something, we kick you out of here, the government has no role to play in that.
Yeah.
They've kicked them out of a private entity, and so that's what mosques all are. They're all private kind of things, so they can run themselves as they like unless they break I mean, if they decided they're going to chop somebody's hand off or execute somebody, then they've broken the civil law and the law comes down on them. But all the business about divorces and whatever, all the kind of things they do in those places, that's pretty much private. But I think that, I don't know of a single Western country that accepts Sharia law in any respect at all.
Oh, no.
So that the effort being made by, say, down in Oklahoma to pass a constitutional amendment saying that Sharia law can't be applied is like trying to, it has as much sense as passing an amendment against gravity or something. It's just empty rhetoric, I guess, trying to play for a grandstand. It's not a threat.
Gravity is coming down upon time again. Yeah. We're running short of time.
I had so many notes. I didn't get to any of them. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Yes, we thank you again.
I've had a good time. I really have. It's been fun.
Thanks. May we have you back?
Sure.
Oh, what an honor. Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you, viewers, for joining us. God loves you so much, and so do we. Bye-bye now.